Hello everyone and welcome to my next YouTube video. Today I'm going to talk about the group of plants that I like most, my favorite flowers. And although when people ask me what's your favorite flower, I always say like it changes, every month it's something else. And I think that's normal because if you just like one thing, you'll never experience all the beautiful plants that are around. But there's always one group of plants that are very dear to me, and they are little orchids, and these are called Corybas. Well, what are Corybas? Like I said, they are orchids, but they are very different than the orchids that you usually find in a garden center. First of all, these are terrestrial plants, which means that they have to be grown in a completely different way than you're used to, but I'm going to explain that later. But first I'm going to tell you something about the plant itself. Every Corybas plant grows from a little tuber, and every tuber makes one single leaf. This one single leaf will or will not flower, but when it flowers, it's just one flower. If you look at the flower closely, you can see very well that it's an orchid. First of all, it has the 6 tepals, which is typical for orchids. One of them is the lip, and then above it you have the dorsal sepal. And then at the sides you have 4 antennae, which are also petals, and altogether they are 6 tepals. And second, and this is probably the most typical feature on an orchid, is that their pistil and their stamen are fused into one organ called a columna. It's complicated, but I'm going to do maybe a video on orchids, but this is very easy to find online. But the thing is that when you see a plant like this is not one plant. This is a bunch of plants. And this pot, for example, is grown from just 2 plants that I planted in this pot, and they colonized the whole pot, and you can take them apart and share them with friends. So the genus Corybas occurs basically from the Himalaya to Taiwan, and then southwards they drop down through Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, the borderlines like the coastal areas of Australia, New Zealand, and they even grow on Macquarie Island, which is a small island south of New Zealand. And there are 2 species of Corybas on that island, which makes the Corybas the most southern occurring orchid in the world. Generally, you can say that they like cool but not frosty areas. Even on Macquarie Island, it's cold, but it's not frosty like for example, an Arctic region. There are just a few species that can tolerate cooler winters, but generally you can consider them to be tropical plants, which makes them really nice subjects for in a house. But before I'm going to talk about these ones, these are the more tropical species, I'm going to talk about another group of Corybas, which is actually more common in the trade. And it's very important that you recognize which species you have before you start to grow them, because the culture does not overlap. If you want to grow one species as the other, it will surely die. I always say that Corybas are very difficult to grow, and that's because they are finicky in their environment. But once you can supply them with this environment, they are actually super easy, like you can see from this one, which I grew from the 2 plants. However, this other group, the Australian Corybas, are different. They are actually probably easier than these ones, but they just have to be grown in a different way. I cannot show you an Australian Corybas at the moment, because this is what they look like at the moment. Australian Corybas is a different group because they go dormant in summer. This is of course logical because Australia has a sort of Mediterranean climate in which the summer is very dry and the winter is cool and moist, and these plants have to adapt. So if I take one of these tubers, I can show you here, this one is actually already sprouting. It's a small bowl-shaped tuber, the size of, well, usually half a centimeter, sometimes almost a centimeter, but that's very rare. Some species make tubers of just a few millimeters. So if you buy one, don't expect a big tuber. They are really tiny. But this is how it survives the summer. And then when the summer starts to cool down, it starts to sprout, as you can see here. And this is the moment that you have to pot them up. So this one is already a little bit advanced. I should have planted it earlier, but at least I can show you now. But this is how they over summer, and the soil that you have to plant it in is already different than the soil you would give these Corybas, for example. It needs to be more mineral, and a very good soil, for example, is loamy sand. I can understand this is difficult to find. When I started to grow these plants, I hated these ingredients because you cannot buy loamy sand in a garden center. So you have to think of the structure the soil has and then think if you can find substitutes. Well, what I found is a very good substrate for these Australian Corybas are the Japanese soils that you can buy in bonsai shops. For example, Akadama and Kiryu. These are used for bonsai, especially pines and maples, for example. And they have a very gritty structure, but the clay pellets also absorb water, which makes that you get a very good balance. Well, if you take this soil, for example, 2 parts, and mix it with some sand and some like potting soil, you can use cocoa fiber or peat based. I know peat is not a popular subject, but I did find out that when using cocoa fiber, you can get a fungal explosion very quickly, which is not good. So for the little soil you use, if you have it, I would go for peat in this case, because it's just better for the plants. So the sand and the peat together, for example, form the last part. So you have 3 parts in together, 2 parts of the Akadama and then 1 part of the sandy potting soil mixture. You can also add some perlite, for example, but basically this is a good mixture to start with. From this moment it becomes a little bit personal if you want to add more potting soil or if you want to keep all the potting soil out. I see people having success with all mixes. What I do have to add with the Japanese mixtures is that they are quite on the acid side, and it helps if you add a little bit of lime or water with alkaline water. If you have tap water which contains a lot of calcium, this is already helpful, because if the soil is too acid, the plants tend to become yellow and they don't form new tubers very well. Well, when you plant the tubers, usually you do this in August, and then you can water them already a little bit. What I then do is that I place them, the pots, in a Ziploc bag. I use Ziploc bags for all my Corybas, and I then place the pot in a sort of non-sunny windowsill. So it must be bright but not sunny, and preferably, if it's possible, I think it's very important actually, it's not when it's possible, you have to do that. Make sure that it's a windowsill which is not heated. So these plants come from an area where the winters are very cool. For example, 10 degrees Celsius more or less. In the daytime it can go up, but especially in the night it has to go down. And this is important for these plants to grow. So place them on a windowsill which cools down in the winter. I have one room that I just turn the heater off, and then it turns into a cold room where I can grow these Corybas. But of course you have to have family that approves that, and not, for example, one of your family members that have to sleep in the cold because you want to grow Corybas. But you know, you have to do something to grow plants, you know. Just don't have children, and then you can grow Corybas. Well, if this all works well, you have to water your plant very little. Just take care that you watch the soil and water every now and then. But basically, because the Ziploc bag is closed, the water recycles itself. And then in a few months you see little leaves popping up, and then a few weeks or a few months later you'll see the flowers coming. When the flowers flower, it's very important to maintain a high humidity. In a Ziploc bag this is not a problem, but if you want to take them for a show, for example, want to show them to your friends, always move them around in the plastic bag, because you will see that after an hour in the dry air the flowers will collapse. When the flowers are finished, they can flower for about a month, sometimes longer, but make sure you remove all the dead flower parts, because if the dead flower parts will rest on the leaf and it will start to rot, sometimes they will take the leaf with them, which is not good because the tubers have to form under the ground, and if they're not finished forming, you can lose your plant. So carefully remove the dead flowers, and then from this moment you can just wait. Water them every now and then. When the leaves are still green, make sure that the soil is moist. You can fertilize very little, but I stress very much that Corybas do not like fertilizer. Use 1/10 of the strength that you would use on normal plants, or just don't fertilize them at all and see what happens. I tend to fertilize them very little with a fertilizer that I got from a bonsai store, which is made from algae. This is a very soft fertilizer, which is perfect for Corybas. And even then I use it at 1/3 of the strength. So after a while, the leaves will turn yellow, and this is the time when you have to open the bag to make sure that the soil can dry out. If this takes too long, take the pot out of the bag and place it next to it, because the soil has to dry out completely. When this happens, you can flip over the pot and dig in the soil to see what your harvest is. And this for me is one of the nicest things on Corybas, because even though the flowers are really pretty, this idea of planting one tuber and harvesting more than one tuber is always very nice. So what are the Australian species that I just mentioned? These are, for example, Corybas hispidus, which is a beautiful plant with bristly large flowers. You have Corybas diamenicus, which is a beautiful flower which is semi-transparent. And then you have Corybas incurvus, in which the edges of the flower of the lip are curved inwards a little bit. These three are the most commonly available Australian Corybas. There are even some varieties of these ones, but these three are the best ones to start with, and generally they are also the cheapest. With Corybas in general, make sure that you start slowly. Don't think like, oh, I love this genus, I'm going to go berserk and buy everything. First of all, Corybas tend to like a person or not. I have given Corybas to people over and over again with the full instructions on how to grow them, and yet these people never manage to keep them alive. So start small, don't spend too much money on them. Buy 1 or 2 species, see if it's something for you, and then expand. A good rule of thumb to see if they grow well for you is if they multiply or not. So if you buy one Corybas and it will remain one Corybas in many years, it's okay, but it's not good. They should really multiply. Okay, having said that, it's time to talk about the tropical species, because in my opinion, these are the most important ones in my video, because most people that are into plants these days are into house plants. And like I said, with the Australian ones, you need this cold room and they have a dormant period, which is always a little bit complicated. The tropical species, they are usually evergreen and they like room temperature. So these are much better to grow, and also they are more appealing, because even though most Australian species have plain green leaves, many of the tropical species have pattern leaves, and some of the species actually have leaves which are not less pretty than that of, for example, an Anthurium crystallinum. So I have 4 species standing in front of me. This is just a small sample of the 120 species of Corybas. This one, for example, is Corybas scutellifer. And scutellifer is a very small species that occurs in Indonesia, and it's quite rare in cultivation. Actually, I got this one as an accident. I ordered another species and this species came out, and I'm quite happy with it because there's not much known about this plant and not many people that were able to make pictures of this one. And taking pictures of Corybas in the wild is crazy. I love to do it, but it's quite difficult because they grow in these mossy, super wet areas, which are usually very tight branches and ferns and plants everywhere. And when you have a plant in a pot, it's much easier to make a picture. So I was really happy about that. And it's also one of the species that multiplies nicely for me. It's not a fast grower, but it grows nice. And then we move to Corybas pictus. Corybas pictus is probably the best known of the tropical species because it's the most commonly cultivated one. And this is because lots of tubers collected from the wild have been imported to Europe and the United States and Japan, and they entered the cultivation. They basically started the interest in Corybas as a group of orchids which is interesting to grow, the tropical Corybas. The Australian ones were already grown way before that, but this one started it off. Also for me, I got tubers from this one. I never realized they were collected in nature, but I got some tubers and I grew them, and quite fast I found out that it was a plant that I really like to grow, and it grew very well for me. This is the only one that's flowering for me now. They tend to flower more in the winter for me, but luckily I had one in flower so I could show you. And then we move to this one. This tiny one is Corybas acarinatus from Thailand. And this species is quite in peril in nature because where it grows, it's not only poached, but also the hills are made of chalkstone, which is very interesting to make cement from. So these hills themselves are actually threatened, and if they are gone, that also means that the only place where this orchid can grow in the wild is also gone. So that's why, even though some of these Corybas have a poached origin, I think it's still very important to grow them, because this one, for example, might as well go extinct in nature, and then it's very nice that we can grow them. This potful was grown from just a few tubers that I got from a friend. I was looking for this species. I didn't want to buy them poached myself, but I got them from a friend who was actually growing them in a plastic box, and he was actually very successful. So I thought, okay, I'm going to give it a try, and it's actually a very easy species to grow. The odd thing about this one is that this is a tropical species that goes dormant in winter. So don't be afraid if all your leaves turn yellow and your plant are gone. Just keep the soil barely moist and still keep it on room temperature, so it's different than the Australian ones. And just wait for spring, water it again, and they will resprout and grow. And then we come to this one, which is undoubtedly my favorite one. This is Corybas Caudatus, and Caudatus means with a tail. And this is because the dorsal sepal, the sepal on the top, has a long thread, which looks like a tail, and this is very rare within Corybas. This species was also an accident. This should never be in a trade, but it was a misidentified species. But this is such a fun species to grow because it grows like a weed. I think this is the Corybas that can take over the hobby as a beginner species to grow, as a species that you can start the hobby with to see if it's something for you. I've been giving the first plants of this one away to people, and they are actually thriving, even people that are not so used to growing Corybas in the beginning. They multiply annually in a rate of more or less 3 to 5. So if you plant one, you harvest 3 or 5 plants the next year. So this is how fast this one grows. Well, the flowers are actually also pretty. I have to say the leaves on this one are quite plain. They have some venation, but it's not very stunning. But the flowers make up for it very nicely because they are big for a Corybas, and they have these white eyelashes and big antennas, and generally they are just stunning. Like I said, I grow these plants in Ziploc bags, and by the time I've been talking, I know, maybe 15 minutes so far, I already see that the first flowers are starting to collapse. So it's time to put them back in their Ziploc bag. And I have to admit, it's maybe not a very pretty way to grow plants because you want to see your plants, but I have found out that growing them in a terrarium is not always suitable. You can grow them in a terrarium if the humidity of the terrarium is really high, constantly. Think of a humidity of 80 to 90%, more or less. So if you have a terrarium which is constantly that moist, without having to fog a lot, because that will make the leaves wet, you could grow them in a terrarium. If it's any drier than that, especially if it goes up and down, the humidity, I really suggest grow them in a Ziploc bag. The other benefit of a Ziploc bag is that I'm quite a lazy waterer. I grow many of the plants that I like on the botanical garden where I work deliberately, because if I go on a holiday, the plants are basically taken care of by experts. These plants, however, in their Ziploc bag can survive 1-2 months without my care, which is ideal. So here I have another bag of Corybas Caudatus that I made last year. And here you can see some important things about this plant. So for example, this one is not flowering, but you can see the stolons hanging outside of the pot. And some of these stolons are already making a tuber. Well, this is very important with Corybas, to know how to grow them, because you plant one plant and it will make these stolons. These stolons are basically a type of root, but they are not really a root. They are more a stem, but they look like roots, and they are looking for a nice spot to make their next tuber. So when they found one, they will drop down, form a tuber, and this is where the plant next year will grow. In some species, like for example Caudatus, one plant makes several new stolons, and this is how it multiplies. With Corybas caudatus, this is also a good way to give it away. So when you have a stolon with a single tuber on it, you can break it off, put it in a little bag with some moist sphagnum or put it in a little jar, and you can send it around. This is how you can transport them very easily. Of course, sending a plant which already has a leaf is nicer, which is also possible, but at least this is one way to multiply them. So what do you do if you got one of these tubers or a small plant? These tropical Corybas, they thrive on sphagnum. I have to say some species, they really need living sphagnum. For example, this one prefers living sphagnum, but I'm going to focus on Caudatus, and with these more complicated species that require living sphagnum, just replace the dead sphagnum for living sphagnum in the substrate. And the substrate, I have to warn you, is extremely difficult. It's about 70% sphagnum and 30% perlite. That's basically it. And you can change. You can actually grow them on 100% sphagnum if you want. Not on 100% perlite though. But everything between 100% sphagnum and 50% sphagnum is wonderful. So you chop the sphagnum, you mix it with perlite, and you're ready to go. Fill a small pot with this substrate and then plant your tuber or your plant in the middle. Make it wet, put it in a bag, place it in a windowsill which doesn't receive sun but it's still very bright, or grow it under artificial light in a terrarium, and that's it. You can start forgetting about your plant and just watch it grow. Fertilizing with these plants is just like with the Australian ones. Fertilize them very lightly. Keep an eye on the plant. When you see that the new leaves are only smaller than the older ones, then it means that the plant is hungry. So give it a little bit of fertilizer. You can even try 1 pellet of Osmocote in the soil, but place it at least, I don't know, maybe 2-3 centimeters away from the leaf. But the problem with Osmocote is that it's very localized. So if the runner goes the other direction, the plant still has nothing. So I would always choose for a fertilizer that you can dilute in water and then give it. Be very careful with organic fertilizers though. The fertilizer I mentioned before with the algae is fine because it has been broken down. There is no process of rotting necessary to get the nutrients to the plants. But if you would, for example, use true organic fertilizer like cow dung or things like that, you can get fungus or bacteria which will actually attack your plant. So be very careful. I have never tried the fancy fertilizers like liquid gold leaf and stuff like that. You have to test it yourself. I would be very careful with fertilizers like liquid gold leaf because they are not normal fertilizer. They are sort of boosters and they are nice to give to a plant for a while. But I always recommend changing your fertilizers, not use one single fertilizer all the time. This is not just for Corybas, but this is for all plants in general. So after a while, when you planted your plants, usually after 1 or 2 years, your plant starts to fill the pot, like you can see here. This is actually, now I look at it, this is not one of my newer pots, this is actually one of my older pots, because I recognize the ferns that are there. So this is the pot that I used to take pieces out to plant into new pots. And you see that the moss after a while starts to deteriorate and lose its vigor because the plants are also starting to yellow a bit. So it means that these plants have to be taken out and replanted. But it's a nice thing to do. I will show you how to do it, because if you get into the stage that you have many Corybas, this is also the way how to multiply them and share them with your friends. First, you start with taking the whole clump out, and then you carefully divide the clump into pieces which you like. For example, you can make a single leaf plant, especially if you want to give them away to many people. This is a good way to start propagating them and having many plants in separate pots. Or you make little clumps of, for example, 4 or 5 leaves and plant these together so that you get a more nicer display plant after a while. In this case, because the moss is quite old, I try to remove as much moss as I can, but I will leave the roots intact as well, because generally I have to say that the Caudatus is quite easy, but in general Corybas are quite sensitive about root disturbance, so don't mess with them too much. But in this case I have to take out all the old moss to make place for the new ones. And then I make the substrate like I mentioned before, and then I make a little hole and plant them in. And I place usually 2 or 3 pots, depending on the size, in a Ziploc bag, and then place them on the windowsill and wait for them to thrive. Usually I wait for the plants to start growing again so that I'm sure that the transplantation worked before I give them away to people, but it's up to you. But it is very important that if you are successful in growing these plants, that you share them. Because like I said, many of these plants are poached, which of course is not a good thing. But also all these Corybas are growing in areas which are threatened by habitat destruction. And therefore I think just protecting them in the wild is not enough. We have to do more than that. And in the case of Corybas, because not so much is known, it's important that we know how to grow them. Because if they become really rare and, for example, a botanical garden gets the task to multiply them in cultivation, it's too late to start learning how to grow them. So we have to do that now. And we have to do that together. It's not just a thing that 1 or 2 people have to do. I think it's important that people know how to grow Corybas, and we can start with the Caudatus, and then eventually more and more species can enter cultivation. Sadly, however, it's still proven to be quite difficult to produce Corybas by seed. There are some rumors that people manage to do it in Taiwan, but sadly the people that manage to do it are not eager to share their secrets, which I think is an awful thing to do because they are threatened. If you have the key on how to save an endangered species and you keep it for yourself, I think you're a little bit of an you can insert a beep there, but anyway, that's not my style, and I hope other people will agree with me that when they can grow Corybas and multiply them, that we have to share them. However, if you're not yet certain that you can grow them, this is not the time to start investing in buying really rare ones, which are probably poached. Don't do that. Only get your Corybas from other people that have been successful in growing them. First of all, you know that the source of your plant is okay, but also I noticed, and some other friends that have been growing Corybas, which were also brought from nurseries from Malaysia, which probably came from the wild, we are not sure, but you know, if plants come out with a wrong name, I don't believe that they come from a nursery. I believe that they came from nature. But what turned out, and which was very interesting, that even within one species, one clone is growable, while the other clone of the same species just disappears. So that's why getting these clones from other people that are able to grow them is also a little bit of a security that the clone that you get is actually a clone that is easy to grow. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this video and love Corybas, well, not as much as I do, but you know, enough to appreciate them. Because they are really stunning plants, and I hope that people will be able to grow them and spread them more, because at the moment they are still very rare. There are not many books on Corybas. If I take, for example, this one, this is an Australian book. This is a very good book which goes quite in detail about how to grow Australian Corybas. Not just Corybas, but all Australian species. But if you want to grow Australian Corybas or any other Australian orchid, I really recommend this book because it's a good guideline. This book helped me a lot in the past. When it comes to tropical Corybas, it's different because this is the only book I have on tropical Corybas, and it's published in 1985. Ever since, there has not been a book on Corybas. There have, of course, been books where Corybas have been added. For example, I have a nice book about Taiwan, books about Borneo, etc. But none of these books says anything about the cultivation of these plants. And this is really a thing that, well, some friends and I had to discover ourselves. So that's why I'm making this video, to put this information out there, and maybe this is of any help to you. If you have any more questions about the cultivation of Corybas, ask them below, because I will read them and I will answer them. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching, and see you next time.